Learning Target 25 says I can calculate z-scores and use them to compare data points. So just as a reminder, a z-score is how we calculate how many standard deviations above or below the mean something is. So it's a way of us comparing two data points in a way that's a little bit more sophisticated than just saying, oh, this data point is higher than this one. Where we can say this data point was 2 standard deviations above the mean, whereas this one was only 1 standard deviation above the mean. And that's sort of a more sophisticated way of comparing two data points. So in the first problem, the snowfall that Boston gets in a year is normally distributed with a mean of 48 inches and a standard deviation of 10 inches. The snowfall in Buffalo, New York is normally distributed with a mean of 94 inches and a standard deviation of 15 inches. Last winter, Boston got 108 inches and Buffalo got 113. The question is, who had a worse winter as compared to a typical winter for each city? Use z-scores to help you decide. So we're not asking you to say, oh, Buffalo got 5 extra inches, therefore their winter was worse. The question asks, who had a worse winter as compared to a typical winter for each city? So we want to compare the snowfall that they got to what is typical for their city. So before we get started, where this is sort of a long word problem and there's lots of information given, I'm just going to jot down the important information by city. So we know that Boston has a mean of 48 and a standard deviation of 10. And we know that Buffalo has a mean of 94 and a standard deviation of 15. So let's start out by calculating the z-scores for the winters last year. So last year, Boston got 108 inches and Buffalo got 113. So let's calculate the z-scores for those two snowfalls. So the idea of a z-score is that you take the data point, the value that you actually got, you subtract off the mean, and you divide by the standard deviation. And that calculation tells you how many standard deviations above or below the mean you are. So Boston's z-score will start with 108, subtract off the mean, which is 48, and divide by the standard deviation, which is 10. So if we do that, we get 60 divided by 10, which is 6. So now let's calculate the z-score for Buffalo. So Buffalo got 113 inches. To calculate its z-score, we're going to take 113, subtract off the mean of 94, and divide by the standard deviation, which is 15. So we end up getting 19 divided by 15, which is about 1.267 if we round up. So let's think about what these two z-scores mean. Boston's z-score is a positive 6, which means that Boston's snowfall was 6 standard deviations above the mean. Buffalo's z-score is a positive 1.267. That means that Buffalo's snowfall was 1.267 standard deviations above the mean. Therefore, we can say that Boston had the worst winter as compared to typical winters, since their snowfall was 6 standard deviations above the mean. While Buffalo's was only 1.267 standard deviations above the mean. So the idea in these problems is that you're going to calculate two z-scores, and that will allow you to compare two data points to what is typical or expected in their situations. In problem number 2, it says, suppose you take a chemistry test and a history test on the same day. The scores on your chemistry test were normally distributed with a mean of 79 and a standard deviation of 7. The scores on your history test were normally distributed with a mean of 83 and a standard deviation of 8. Suppose you earn an 86 on both your chemistry test and your history test. The question is, which one did you do better on as compared to your classmates in each class? Use z-scores to help you decide. So once again, I'm just going to copy down the information that I know to make sure I don't get the two tests confused. So for Chem had a mean of 79 and a standard deviation of 7. In history, you had a mean of 83 and a standard deviation of 8. And then you earned an 86 on both your chemistry test and your history test. So your score in history and chem was actually the same. But the question is, which one did you do better on as compared to your classmates in each class? So let's get started calculating some z-scores. So to calculate your z-score for chem, we're going to take your score of 86, subtract off the mean, which is 79, and divide by the standard deviation, which is 7. If you do that out, you're going to end up getting 7 over 7, which is just exactly 1. So your score on your chemistry test was exactly 1 standard deviation above the mean for that class. So now let's do the same thing for history. So you got a score of 86. The mean was 83, so you'll do 86 minus 83. And then you'll divide by the standard deviation for that class. So you end up getting 5 over 8. So that's definitely going to be less than 1 standard deviation above the mean. It's actually going to be exactly 0.625 standard deviations above the mean. So you did better on your chemistry test than you did on your history test. On both your tests, your scores were above the mean, but in chemistry you scored 1 standard deviation above the mean, whereas in history you only scored 0.625 standard deviations above the mean. So you performed better on chemistry because you scored 1 standard deviation above the mean. In history, you only scored 0.625 standard deviations above the mean. So in each of these problems, you'll calculate two z-scores. Your z-scores tell you how many standard deviations above or below the mean you are. If you have a positive z-score, you're above the mean. If you have a negative z-score, you're below the mean. And once you have the two z-scores, you can compare which one was further above or below the mean.